Today, we're going to talk about several things that are important to us staying safe on the roads, not only keeping us safe on the roads, but also keeping others safe on the road. Defensive driving is about protecting, as the word defensive would imply. We're protecting ourselves and we're protecting others in our vehicle or others on the road along with us. Not just by not making mistakes while we're driving, but by actively trying to avoid the mistakes of others as well. And so our objectives today are to understand and adjust for certain things that will help us be more or better defensive drivers. Number one, space, understanding using space and managing space around your vehicle when in traffic. Also speed, how does that affect our ability to be safe while we're on the road? Right-of-ways are another very important area where a lot of accidents occur, where we need to heighten our awareness and implement defensive driving tactics. Backing is a very common cause of accidents that occur, and so we'll talk about how to avoid backing accidents. And adjusting for conditions, and that's multifaceted. And so when we get into that, I'll talk about various types of conditions that we need to adjust for. And ultimately, we're going to talk about seatbelt use, which is the number one quickest, easiest, and best defense that we have against death and serious injury when in an automobile. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, that first objective is understanding space. If you are to be a defensive driver, utilizing and managing the space around your vehicle is absolutely essential. One thing that space does for us, as we have more space between our vehicle and other vehicles around us, is it gives us more information. When we aren't right up behind the vehicle in front of us or have too many vehicles packed around us, we're able to see more of our driving environment. That visibility, that open visibility, gives us greater information. I think it's really important to remember that what you need to be able to make a good decision in any circumstance is good information and time to be able to process that information. And that's also something that space provides for us. Space gives us the time. If we have more space between us and an object or another vehicle, we have more time before there's a potential collision with that object as well. So good space, it gives us good information and time to be able to use that information to be able to avoid accidents. Space also gives us more options. The more space we build around our vehicle in traffic, whether it's to the front or to the back or to the sides, the more places we have that we can go in an emergency to be able to avoid a hazard that comes up while we're on the road. So let's talk about some specific tools that we need to understand to manage that space around our vehicle. First is the following distance. Probably maybe first and most important is that following distance. This is the space that we have the best control over when we're behind the wheel. If there's a vehicle, if we're too close to the vehicle in front of us, it is totally within our control to slow down and increase that space cushion. We also have the ability perhaps to change lanes if the next lane over has a greater space available in that space. And so maintaining that front space cushion is probably what we need to do most, focus our attention on. We talk about the 3-second rule. The 3-second rule means the distance between you and the vehicle in front of you. How long does it take for you to reach that same point in the road that that vehicle in front of you is at right now? So if that vehicle up there passes a fixed object, you count 1,001, 1,002, 1,003 before you also get to that object. If you get to that object before 1,003, then you need to back off and slow down a little bit to have that adequate space cushion. Sometimes we may need to have more than 3 seconds. If it's raining, if it's snowing, if the weather conditions are bad, we should add maybe 1, or especially if it's snowing, at least 2 seconds to that following distance. If we're driving a very heavy vehicle, or if we're towing a trailer, that makes it more difficult to stop. And so you should add extra time to that 3 seconds, depending on the vehicle that you're driving and the circumstances that you're in. For each adverse condition that exists, maybe you should add another second to that. And so space cushion is very important. Now let's take a look at what an example of this relationship between space, visibility, and time looks like. We can see what space can do for us when it comes to visibility, identifying hazards, and avoiding an accident. That vehicle that came up and passed us totally deprived itself of any visibility where it was going. By entering that lane and quickly crossing over multiple lanes, that person could not see what was going on in the lane that they were moving into, which led to probably a fatal accident here. And so it's very important that we maintain and manage those space cushions, optimize our visibility so that we can make the best driving decisions. Also, when it comes to our space cushions, we need to think about our ability to stop. If there is a hazard in front of us, how long is it going to take us to be able to stop to avoid that hazard? Or a real common one is driving in heavy traffic when the traffic suddenly stops. And we need to be able to stop before that vehicle in front of us, before we hit that vehicle in front of us. There's 3 distances in your stopping distance that you need to be aware of. One is your perception distance, your reaction distance, and ultimately your braking distance. Lots of times we tend to think of it just in terms of our braking distance. Oh, I can stop within this distance, but we kind of forget often that we have to identify a hazard before we can react to it. Sometimes you'll see something in the road and you'll be looking at it, and number one, trying to determine how far away is that, or what is it? Is that a hazard? Is that a piece of paper, or is that, a block of wood up there in the lane? And so there's time while you're identifying the hazard, and while you are thinking about looking at and identifying that hazard, your vehicle's still moving. So you're getting closer and closer to the hazard while you're making that identification and decision. What am I going to do? Once I've made a decision, then my brain has to send the impulses to my hands and feet to make the maneuver that I'm going to use to avoid that collision as well. And so that is also time involved in that, getting that message, from your brain to your foot. Doesn't seem like maybe that's a lot of time, but it could be a quarter of a second, or more that it takes for that alone to happen. And we are traveling distance while that is happening. And then ultimately, once your foot's on the brake, if that's your decision and your maneuver, how long is it going to take your vehicle to come to a stop? And that's going to be different depending on the vehicle that you're driving, and depending on the tires that are on your vehicle and the weather and the conditions of the road that you're on. And so it's going to take so long to stop. Just kind of a generic example is that at 30 miles an hour, it takes about 153 feet to bring your vehicle to a stop. Almost half of that distance is your perception distance. While you're identifying the hazard and making a decision at 30 miles an hour, you're going to travel about 77 feet. And then you get your foot on the brake and you have to be able to stop the vehicle too. At 70 miles an hour at freeway speeds, you're talking about 1/10 of a mile that you need for perception distance, reaction distance, and stopping distance. And so that kind of emphasizes the importance of managing that space cushion and having that good space between you and the vehicle in front of you. We also need to think about how we manage the space to the sides and to the rear. Is there somebody tailgating you? They're too close behind you. How can you open up that space cushion? Well, you may encourage that person to pass you by slowing down a little bit, or you may get out of the lane, that they're in, if there's multiple lanes, and let them go ahead and pass you. So we can open up that space behind us, even though that's a little bit more difficult for us to control, by helping that person to either be able to pass us or encourage them to go around us. The space is to your side. If you've got cars just traveling right in your blind spot or right next to you on the freeway, slow down or speed up a little bit to get past them, and maybe change lanes to get into a more manageable space cushion where you've got room to your left and to your right, so that if something happens, you have more options than just to hit the brake. If you know that you're clear to the left and you can change lanes to avoid a hazard, that's a great option to be able to have. And that all comes back to that defensive driving skill of managing your space around your vehicle. Here's another video example of how important it is to manage that space cushion so that we have good information while we're driving the vehicle, and then get that information with enough time to be able to react and avoid an accident. At this point, we just passed a car in the right lane. We could have changed lanes to the right lane, which is a safer lane to be in, especially on an undivided road. We're about a second behind the car in front of us, so that is blocking our vision and our time to be able to react to what occurs. And so this is a good example. That car in front, that white pickup truck, had the visibility, and it was able to see this vehicle coming toward him, crossing the yellow line, and was able to maneuver to the right to avoid that collision. In the vehicle that we're in, we have no ability to do that, because we didn't allow ourselves the time to react by being only 1 second behind that vehicle in front of us. We also put ourselves in a more dangerous situation by choosing to remain in the more hazardous lane, which was the left lane on an undivided road. And so again, and there's other ways that we could look at this as well, but I encourage you to think about that. How do I manage my space cushions? Am I giving myself ultimate visibility? Am I able to make decisions within the time that I have between myself and the objects around me? Another consideration for being a defensive driver is your speed. Speeding is the #1 unsafe behavior that drivers engage in that results in serious injury or death. I think if you're reading in the newspaper of an account of a traffic accident or something, more often than not, you're going to see a statement in there by an investigating officer that says, speed was a factor here. And when we are driving, obviously, speed's a necessity. We're not going to get where we're going if we don't go a speed. But when we choose to drive faster than what is necessary or faster than what's safe for the conditions, we are accepting extra risk on top of the risk already inherent in driving. For every 10 miles an hour faster you go, if you're in an accident at that speed, you double your risk of death. And so let's say, the speed limit is, you're out on I-15 and the speed limit's 70 miles an hour, and you choose to go 80 miles an hour. Just because maybe you're in a hurry and you want to get where you're going, or maybe the flow of traffic's 80 miles an hour, so you decide to go with the flow of traffic. You just made a decision to double your risk of death unnecessarily. And it's not just you that you're doubling your risk of death for, it's for the passengers in your vehicle as well as those in other vehicles that you may collide with in an accident. And we can see that factor will multiply rapidly if you choose to go 20 over the speed limit. Now you've got 4 times the risk of death. If you choose to go 30 over, now you've got 8 times the risk of death if you're in an accident at that speed. And so it's important to make sure that you understand the risk of your driving behavior, understand the risk that you're accepting for yourself, but also that you are imposing on others, because others can't control you. And so but others are exposed to your risk. And so we need to think about, is that right for us to arbitrarily impose risk on others in an unsafe way? And so think about that as you are out there driving, as you think about your commitment to driving a safe speed. The speed limits on our roads are based in the design of the roads. So a speed limit, is only going to exist on a road if the traffic engineers have determined that that's an acceptable speed for that road, for that surface, for that condition. When we choose to go over the speed limit, we are going beyond, those limits that have been determined are safe. And we also have to recognize that conditions can change and be different. What is a safe speed? It's not just the speed limit that determines what a safe speed is. There's a lot of situations where, a safe speed is maybe less than the speed limit. The basic speed law tells us that we shouldn't drive faster than what is safe for the conditions. And so we need to take into account what are these conditions that we need to adjust for. And I would point out that there are conditions outside of the vehicle, there's conditions in the vehicle, and there are conditions within the driver as well that we need to be taking into consideration when we're talking about conditions. The most common condition that we adjust for is weather. Is it raining? Is it snowing? Are the roads wet or dry? Those are things that are really good to take into account. Also, the condition of the road. Are we in a construction zone? That's going to really change the condition of the road and what is safe, not just for us, but for other travelers on the road and for construction workers working on the road. And sometimes different times a year, we see the road in varying states of condition. After winter storms and in the spring, it might be more common to see potholes and stuff in the road. That's obviously going to change the condition and what's safe for that, a safe speed for that road. Also traffic, the time of day, the light, whether it's nighttime or daytime or dawn or dusk, those are conditions that we need to adjust for. If traffic is heavy or traffic is light, that's going to make a difference in what's a safe speed for that road as well. And it's kind of an interesting factor when we talk about traffic. Often, it's when traffic is the heaviest that we seem to be in the greatest hurry to try and get where we're going. When traffic is heavy, people tend to bunch up a little bit more to give themselves less space, less visibility. And so when that traffic is heavier is actually when we should be trying to distance ourselves a little bit more, make sure we manage that space cushion, and be aware that other drivers are more likely to be impatient and do unexpected maneuvers. And so heavier traffic is definitely a condition where we need to slow down, not speed up for. Another thing we need to think about is the condition of the vehicle. Some vehicles are going to be safer than other vehicles at higher speeds. Some vehicles, just by the way they are built and designed, will handle better at higher speeds. But for most of us, the big difference would come in whether we're driving, a light car or a light pickup truck versus a heavy truck. And obviously that's a big determining factor. The way that heavy truck is going to handle if you need to do an evasive maneuver, or how quickly that truck can stop, depending on whether it's empty or full or pulling a trailer. There's a lot of factors in there in the vehicle. And then the condition of the vehicle, you have the right tires on for the season. Are your tires in good condition? Are there other problems with the vehicle that maintenance needs to address to make that vehicle safe? And if we know that there's a deficiency, in addition to getting that vehicle back for maintenance, we need to maybe slow down because we know that that vehicle is not in top condition. And then the condition of the driver. There's a lot of things that can go on within the driver that can create unsafe conditions. If the driver's not feeling well, if the driver's overly distracted, if the driver's tired, all of these things are conditions that exist within the driver that need to be addressed as well. Maybe not just for how fast we're going, but all of our other decisions that we are making as a defensive driver. The next area that we want to discuss where we have a lot of risk is in right-of-way issues. Now, right-of-ways usually are dealing with intersections. They could be dealing with merging lanes, merging onto the freeway, or when one lane ends. But when we're talking about especially intersections, we have to be extra careful because intersections have a high risk for a collision of two vehicles going in directions that are perpendicular to each other. If you have a vehicle run a red light and collide with a car going through the intersection on its green light, we have that side impact collision there. And that's a collision that has a very high risk of death because the side of the vehicle, the door of that vehicle, does not provide the same impact safety as the front bumper or the back bumper does. There's a lot of material between you and the front bumper and between you and the back of the vehicle. So if there's a collision, there's a lot more protection for you in that zone. But when you get hit right on your door, there's not a lot of protection there for you. So that side collision puts you at much greater risk for death, you or somebody else. So we might want to talk about how do we be safe in intersections? And there's a couple of uh, skills that I would like to suggest that you try. And number one, as we're going through this, I'd like you to think about, what can I do better? I think it's important to remember that we all are not perfect drivers. None of us are perfect drivers. Even the best are not perfect drivers. We all get distracted, and we all have, different things happen where we could make a mistake. And it's important to recognize, where our deficiencies are. And so I'm going to invite you, as we go through this presentation, to think about, what can I do better? Maybe set a goal or two goals of how you'd like to try and improve your defensive driving skills over the next year. Maybe you're not a defensive driver at all, and you just need to try and be a more defensive driver. Maybe there's some specific things that we're going to talk about. This could be one right here, talking about, how do I negotiate intersections? One thing that we need to remember whenever we approach an intersection is, we need to remember that that is a high risk area. If we have an accident in that intersection, that is an accident that is more likely to cause a serious injury or even a death. And so as I approach that high risk area in my driving, I want to take certain precautions. I want to double check and make sure that that intersection is clear for me to go through, even if I've got a green light. And kind of the tendency is to think, well, I've got a green light, so I can just focus straight ahead and go. But that's the mistake that sometimes we make. Even though you have the right of way, even though you have that green light, you should still glance to the left and to the right before you get into the intersection, to make sure that the traffic on that perpendicular route of travel is stopped or stopping. Just verify that before you get into the intersection. As you're doing that, instead of having your foot on the gas, take your foot off the gas and just hold it above the brake. That's called covering the brake. And that way, if you do see a problem as you're approaching the intersection, it shortens your reaction time. It allows you to get your foot on the brake that much sooner, and hopefully be able to avoid an accident if you see one in that intersection, a potential accident. So that's one thing you can do. Scan the intersection before you get to it, always, whether you've got the right of way or not. Another tool I would like you to think about using in intersections is one that we called delayed acceleration. This is one in particular where I've had a lot of people over the years of teaching this class call me afterwards and say, you know what? I tried that delayed acceleration skill and I avoided an accident. And it would have been a bad one too. And I've been there also. I've avoided accidents using delayed acceleration. And this is what it is. If you are stopped at an intersection and you are the first car at the limit line, at that intersection, at that red light, and you're waiting for that green light, when that light does turn green, before you put your foot on the gas, look to your left and make sure that the traffic is stopping and that there's not anybody running that red light before you go. And look to the right real quick also and make sure that side is stopping. But look to the left first. If you just take a second or two to glance to the left and right, even though you've got a green light, to make sure that other vehicles are responding and stopping, that can help you avoid very serious accidents. And here's an example. Kind of a grainy video, but we've got a vehicle running the red light. In fact, if we go back and look at this from the beginning again, again, it's kind of a grainy video, but we can see that there are red lights here and that white truck going the other direction coming towards us is running a red light. Now, the vehicles that are to the left of the screen here that are going to come in and get hit, if they did that delayed acceleration or that scanning of the intersection prior to entering the intersection, they could have avoided this collision. And given that that collision was right on the side of that vehicle, on that door, there's a pretty high chance that the driver in that car it was injured very seriously or maybe even killed. And so delayed acceleration, think about that. Glance left and right before you go through that intersection when that light turns green. Another area that I would like to talk about is backing up. We see almost half of all of our auto claims with our backing incidents, where either we're backing up into another vehicle or somebody backs up into our vehicle. course, the one we see most frequently in our claim system is where we're backing up into somebody else because, you know, that's generally going to be our fault. And so we see that in our claim system. But, you know, often that's 40 to 50% of all of our auto claims every year. We have about 300 to 400 auto claims in the Utah Local Government's trust pool every year. And if you think about that, almost half of those being backing accidents. Wouldn't it be great if we could just avoid all backing accidents? That's something I'm going to propose to you today. Maybe make it a goal. I will not have a backing accident. And backing accidents are 100, especially ones that you would be at fault for, are 100% preventable. If you just take a little extra time and some extra precautions to make sure that the space is clear that you're backing into, we can avoid all of these backing accidents. Backing accidents often are just very minor damage, you know, not a big deal, but they do sometimes actually result in injuries and even deaths. About 280 people each year are killed in backing accidents where a car backs into them or pins them in between the car and a fixed object. Sometimes we often see that they're young children that are getting run over in backing accidents because they aren't high enough for us to see them out the back window if they're standing behind our vehicle. And often they get run over right in the family driveway by the family car. And so we want to make sure we're extra careful anytime we're backing up, because from your driver's seat, it is impossible to see what is right behind your vehicle unless you've got a backup camera. And we'll talk a little bit about using backup cameras too as we go through here. So what's the problem? Well, you know, we drive forward a lot more than we drive backwards. We have a lot more practice driving forward. We drive less than a mile a year in reverse, more than likely. Most of us probably don't back up that far when we do back up. And we only back up for, 10, 15 seconds. And then we're, going forward for a half hour or an hour. And so we spend a lot more time going forward. We have a lot more practice going forward. And so that's part of the problem, is that, it's something we don't do as much. Anytime you're doing something in any area of safety, anytime you're doing something that you don't do very often, you're much more likely to have an accident doing that thing. And when it comes to driving, backing is something we do less often than driving forward. And so we need to take some extra precautions. Another thing that tends to be a factor is, the vehicle's design. The vehicle is designed to drive forward, to maneuver going forward, with the best visibility. When you look out the back, when you're backing, you can't see as much. There's more things blocking your vision. And so obviously the vehicle isn't really designed to optimize visibility when going backwards. When you're backing up, also the vehicle maneuvers different than when it's going forward. And so again, that comes into play with that. How much practice do we have going backwards versus forwards? But when you back up and turn, your vehicle goes two different directions at the same time. My front end will swing out one direction and my back end will swing out the other direction. And I can only look at one of those at the same time. And so I've got a direction of motion that I'm not looking at, which makes that backing maneuver a little bit more difficult. What are some things that we can do to avoid backing accidents? Well, number one, if we don't have to back up, let's not back up. We call that unnecessary backing. If you choose to park your vehicle in a space that you're going to have to back out of, when another parking space was available that you could pull forward out of, that is an example of unnecessary backing. So I encourage you to avoid backing by parking someplace where you don't have to back up when you leave that parking space. And often, if you don't have a choice, if you're going to have to back up, from a certain parking space that you have to use, it may be best, depending on the circumstances and the conditions, to back into that parking space when you're parking rather than when you're leaving. There's a lot of information that it's safer to back when you're arriving because you have a good clear view that nothing is in that parking space when you begin to back into it. But when we back up on departure, often we haven't had a good clear view of what's right behind us. Again, do we take time to prepare for that backing maneuver, or do we just hop in, turn the key, put it in reverse and go? You know, do we really think about it? Do we go slow? Do we make sure that that maneuver is safe while we're doing it? Often people seem to back out of a parking space like they're off to the races. And that's just really a bad idea. It doesn't take you that much longer to go really slow out of that parking space than backing up really fast, because you're only going to be traveling, you know, 30 feet, you know, 20 or 30 feet in that backing maneuver. So what does it matter whether you do that at you know, 2 or 3 miles an hour or 10 miles an hour? It's not going to save you, you know, any significant time by rushing out of a parking space. So be very careful anytime you're in reverse. And one acronym that's really helpful to be able to avoid backing accidents is GO.A.L, get out and look. You know, before you get into that vehicle to back it up, make sure you walk to both ends of the vehicle. Make sure you know what's in front of you and what's behind you, especially whichever direction you're going to be leaving, whether you're backing out or going forward out. Make sure you see if there's anything in front or behind of that vehicle before you move. You know, make sure that, you know, you've looked. Some things that we can do policy wise is maybe require placing a cone behind the vehicle that the driver has to go retrieve before they leave. Some of our municipal members do that, have that kind of a policy. But whether we have a policy that requires that walk around, you know, or some, you know, gimmick that we do that helps encourage us to do that walk around, as a driver, we need to make sure we're taking that responsibility to walk around that vehicle before we move it. It's also a good opportunity to take a quick look at the vehicle, you know, for any problems with the tires or any damage to the vehicle that may have occurred while it was parked. Often you'll get damage on a vehicle in a parking lot and you weren't even around when it happened. And then your boss later on is going, hey, you know, what happened to this truck you were driving? And you go, I don't know. If you can identify that damage before you leave that parking space, it gives you a lot more credibility when you have to answer, you know, for that damage and what happened, instead of just not knowing what happened. If you have to back up, especially if you're backing up a large vehicle, use a spotter. If you're backing up a trailer, use a spotter. That's a really important rule. But if you're using a spotter, make sure you all understand how that, you know, activity works. Number one, whoever is driving the vehicle is responsible, you know, for that maneuver, to make sure that maneuver can be done safely. The driver gives directions to the spotter where they need the spotter to be. Make sure that they agree upon the signals that they're going to use. If you're using hand signals as you're spotting somebody and guiding them backwards, you know, you better make sure that the hand signal you're using is understood by the driver, and maybe they're not, you know, accustomed to a different hand signal or no hand signals at all. So make sure that you understand how you're going to communicate, whether that's verbally or whether that's, you know, using hand signals, and what those signals are. And drivers, always remember, if you can't see your spotter, stop. Do not move the vehicle. More than likely, it means your spotter is behind you. And that's another way that these fatalities occur every year. In the fire service, for example, on average, about one firefighter dies every year somewhere in the United States because they get crushed behind an apparatus as it's being backed up. And they're out there spotting and they're walking right behind the vehicle and they wind up getting crushed. So if you can't see your spotter, stop. Don't move the vehicle. I also told you that we were going to talk a little bit about using backup cameras. I think backup cameras are one of the best tools that we can use to help us avoid backing accidents. However, they're not the solution to everything. And it's important that we realize when you're using a backup camera, it's not the only thing that you use. You still need to use your mirrors, your side mirrors, your inside mirror. You need to turn your head and look out the windows. You know, you should still get out and look before you move the vehicle. Just looking in the backup camera is not a good way to do a backing maneuver, because a backup camera employs a wide angle lens so that we have a widest field of vision possible, you know, from a very small camera lens on the back of your vehicle. Because that's a wide angle lens, everything that's in the periphery of your screen is going to look much smaller than it really is. Whatever object is right on the ground directly behind you is going to look pretty big and in your face, like this tricycle does. but everything that is 10, 20 feet away is going to look really small. So if all you're doing is looking in that backup camera, it's really easy to miss, cross traffic that's approaching from one side or the other because it's so small as it enters the screen. And then by the time it's behind you, then it's really big, but that's too late. And so make sure that you understand the field of vision of your backup camera and understand that the things that are far away in your backup camera or look really far away in your backup camera are really a lot closer than they seem. So you still need to turn your head, look out the windows, use your mirrors, and use the backup camera. The backup camera is best used to verify that there's nothing directly behind your vehicle. It's not a very good tool for a wider perception or perspective. We talked about conditions earlier, adjusting our speed, for changing conditions. Let's talk just a little bit more about these different conditions that we need to adjust for. I mentioned that you have conditions that are outside of the vehicle, and then there's conditions that are in the vehicle or the vehicle itself. And then we need to be thinking about the condition of the driver. And this is going to lead us into several different topics here as we go through. But collisions happen when drivers fail to adapt to changing conditions, whatever those conditions may be. Every accident is a failure to adapt to a change in condition. So let's talk about the driver. Let's kind of go backwards on this list here. What are some things with the driver that we may need to adapt to or make changes, depending on the condition? Does the driver's attitude contribute to accidents happening? And the answer is absolutely yes. Often when we are driving, we may be experiencing some negative emotions. You may be feeling angry while you're driving the vehicle. Maybe you feel frustration because other drivers around you, you think, or actually are doing things that are unreasonable and crazy. And so that can make you really frustrated. Sometimes we just have slow traffic or traffic jams and we get impatient, or sometimes we may even, by our own, choices, limit ourselves on time. And so we're running behind, we're late getting someplace we need to be, and we're really impatient. So do we allow anger, frustration, or impatience to make our driving decisions? And one of the most important things we really need to think about is that driving and the decisions that are made while driving need to be made using your rational part of your brain, okay? That frontal lobe where reasoning occurs. We need to be very careful and logical about the decisions that we make while we're operating a vehicle. Allowing anger, frustration, or impatience to contribute to a decision is always going to lead to a poor decision. And so if you are feeling as the driver, like you are in one of these states or a combination of these states, you need to try and put those in check. You need to set them aside. If you are unable to control your anger, frustration, or impatience while you're driving, maybe it's time to stop and let somebody else drive. A driver definitely needs to be able to separate, emotions and impulse from their driving decisions that they make. Here's an example, another video. I hope this comes through so you can see it. We've got a situation here where we've got one driver tailgating the other. The driver that's being tailgated is, not getting out of the way. You can see they're in the left lane. So when he has the opportunity, he comes up, passes on the right. Oh, but you know what? He's going to let his anger influence him here. He's going to slow down and come back so he can give this driver a piece of his mind. Excuse the gesture there. And now he's going to speed off again. And he's going to send another message by cutting this driver off. Oh, and losing control of his vehicle. Now, in this example, we have two drivers that are both, impaired. They're both impaired by their emotions. The one driver is filming this guy tailgating them. And so that's obviously, that they're allowing something to impair their judgment there because they're making a video while they're driving. They don't like this person tailgating them. And so they've gotten just distracted, by this other driver that's being aggressive towards them. They're both being aggressive drivers. Anytime you think you need to communicate something to another driver in an unfriendly way, it's probably not a good idea. It's best to just kind of, let that water roll off the duck's back, just let it go. Don't worry about it. When we start one-upping each other or trying to, give someone a piece of our mind or showing them, what's what, then we wind up getting distracted from the driving and making really bad driving decisions. Driver impairment, again, a condition that we need to adjust for. And maybe that adjustment is don't drive, right? What can impair drivers? Well, substances. It could be alcohol or drugs, that causes an impairment of a driver, but there could also be other physiological things going on with the driver. Fatigue or illness could also cause a level of driver impairment. In fact, fatigue can be, as great or greater of an impairment, especially if you fall asleep at the wheel, than driving under the influence of alcohol is. Distraction is also an impairment. Think about that video we just looked at with the driver distracted while they're making a video of somebody else and they're driving at the same time, and the other driver getting distracted by, wanting to send a message to the other driver. That's an impairment, when we allow our emotions to make decisions behind the wheel. So, if you're in an emotional state, that's also an impairment. So anytime that you're in these situations, whether you're talking about substances, alcohol or drugs, we know we want to avoid that, zero tolerance for that. We shouldn't drive if we've, taken any substances that may impair us. But we also need to think about, our physical condition, our mental condition, and our emotional condition as well when we're making those driving decisions. And is that something we can do something about? Can I put my emotions in check? Hopefully I can. If I'm really, really tired, can I just snap my fingers and not be tired anymore? No. So I maybe need to make a different decision there. And so I need to think about, for example, someone who's tired, what should they do? Let's get off the road. If you're really tired, if your eyelids are heavy, if your head's, nodding, if you're blinking a lot, if you're yawning, let's get some rest. Let's get that vehicle off the road. Let somebody else drive. Often when I'm driving long distances, if I have to go to Vernal or Moab to teach a class or to do some risk assessments, I'll leave extra early. If I know it takes me 4 hours to get there, I give myself at least 4.5 hours to get there. And if I leave early and I get really tired on the way because I'm leaving at 3 or 4 in the morning or something, then, I have time to stop and take, a 10 or 15-minute nap. If I can find a safe place to pull over and do that. And I do that frequently, if I'm driving, late or early in the morning and I get tired, I get off the road. I don't keep pushing myself, and a lot of things we can do will also help make you more alert. Drinking caffeine may help you be more alert. Eating a snack may help you be more alert. Talking to someone, may help you be more alert. However, these other things that you do to help wake you up when you're driving, aren't really giving your body rest. Caffeine, for example, it may get you alert, for a short period of time, but it's gonna wear off and you're gonna be tired again. And you're still driving. Drinking something or eating something can be a distraction. Talking to somebody can be a distraction as well. And so there's a lot of reasons why if you're tired and you're driving, we should, default to the let somebody else drive, pull over, get some rest, rather than trying to do things to try and wake us up to keep us going. That's not as good of a decision. Distraction is another condition that we need to adjust for, and it's very important. What kind of things can distract us while we're driving? Well, there's a lot of different things. There's eating, there's grooming, there's, getting too engrossed in something you're listening to on the radio. There's conversations in the vehicle with other people. Maybe you've got kids in the back seat that are bouncing around and poking each other. There's all sorts of things that can distract us, and we need to have a plan for how we're going to manage these distractions, because anything that takes your mind off the road and off the vehicle is going to put you at greater risk. If you think about your mind as a deck of cards, you got 52 cards in a deck of cards, and your mind is that, analogous 52 cards. If you're dealing, 10 cards over here to a conversation, and 5 cards over here to messing with your music selection on the radio, you're not driving with the full deck. Anything that is taking your concentration from the road is a distraction, and potentially could lead to an accident because of that lack of attention to the road. So manage those distractions. The biggest ones that we see, and the ones that are of greatest concern, are those distractions that distract us in a visual way, in a cognitive way, and in a physical way. In other words, they will take our mind off of the driving task. They'll take our eyes off the driving task, or they'll even take our hands away from the driving task. And some things can do all of those. For example, trying to send a text message while you're driving is going to take your mind off the road, your eyes off the road, and at least one of your hands off the wheel. And so that is a distraction in all 3 of those areas. And so when we look at the distraction of driving, talking, having a conversation while you're driving, especially if it's on a cell phone, is going to give you a greater risk of accident, 4 times greater risk of having an accident while you're talking on a cell phone. But that in-car conversation is also a risk. It's also a distraction. And so be careful about those as well. The one thing you have going for you with an in-car conversation is your passenger that you're talking to also has eyes and can see what's going on around, and they may alert you to something that you're missing, whereas the person on the other end of the phone can't do that for you. But besides that, the conversation is the same level of distraction. So be careful with that. Texting is even worse. You're 6 times a greater risk of having an accident while you're texting and driving. And texting while driving, because it does impact both your visual attention, your mental attention, and your physical attention, it creates a situation where it has an impairment equality of blood alcohol content of 0.16. It's a massive impairment to your ability to drive if you're trying to type on a computer or send a text message while the vehicle is moving. And for especially those of you in law enforcement, I can't stress this enough, except in the most extreme emergencies, stop the vehicle to enter anything on the computer or to be looking at things on the computer screen, unless it's just absolutely necessary in an emergency situation. Make sure that you have those wheels stopped before you do that. So driving distracted, how do we, deal with this? Number one, admit it. It's kind of like being an addict, right? If you think about 12 steps, one of the first things you got to do is you have to recognize that you have a problem. A lot of us out there don't believe that our distractions are a problem for us. A lot of us think that we are somehow more gifted than everybody else on the road, and that we can talk on the phone and drive, or send a text message and drive, because we're just that much better than other drivers. It's bad if somebody else does it, but I can do it. That's a danger right there. So the first thing we need to do is we need to admit that we are susceptible to distraction. And what distracts other people is also a distraction for us as well. Then we need to identify, what are our distractions? Do I have a tendency to eat while I'm driving? Recognizing that that's a problem allows me to maybe change my plans, and not eat while I'm driving. Remove the distraction. I did a defensive driving class once with some teenagers, and I shared a video that really scared them about, texting while driving. And they, as they left the room, several of them told me, I'm going to turn my phone off and put it in the glove box from now on whenever I'm driving. That is phenomenal risk management coming from a teenager, that they recognize we need to remove the hazard, and make sure that we're just not going to respond to it while we're driving. You know, if the distraction is unavoidable, stop the vehicle. You know, if you have to look at that computer screen, if you have to take that phone call, you know, especially if it's going to be an in-depth, you know, conversation that you're going to be getting into, pull over in a safe place, stop the vehicle, plan ahead. You know, when you get in the vehicle, set your air conditioning controls and your radio controls and your seat adjustments, and do all that before you move the vehicle. Anything that may be distracting you while you're driving, get it all settled and in place before you go. Also, plan ahead to give yourself time to get where you're going. Give yourself extra time to get where you're going, so don't feel like you have to speed, so you don't, get into these emotions of being impatient, you know, because you're behind the clock. Remember, you are responsible. When you're operating the vehicle, you're the captain of that ship. You know, just like if you get on a commercial airliner, you expect the pilot in the cockpit to be the most professional, the most skilled, the most experienced, you know, one available. I mean, you're really hoping that they're that. Every time you get behind the wheel, that's you too. You know, you need to be the most professional, the most skilled, the most experienced, the most cautious and careful. Ultimately, the last thing I want to talk about is wearing your seatbelt. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that wearing your seatbelt is your best defense against serious injury or death. It only takes a couple of seconds to put your seatbelt on. And I don't care what the situation is. We've had situations where years ago, probably 10 years ago, I remember a claim that came through for a police officer who was killed in a motor vehicle accident while he was in a pursuit of a stolen vehicle. And because that officer wasn't wearing a seatbelt, because, you know, getting on the pursuit was just, you know, that 2 seconds, you know, was too much time to deal with before getting into that pursuit, that officer lost his life. And that was a huge impact on his family, on his department. And it was really a sad thing. And a seatbelt probably would have saved his life. So no matter what you're doing, so no matter how long, you know, the trip is, whether the trip is 1 block or 100 miles, buckle that seatbelt every time. It's got to be a habit. If you don't do it every time, it's not a habit. You know, and every now and then, and I'm really good about wearing my seatbelt. I'm probably one of the best seatbelt wearers you'll ever meet. But even I, from time to time, will think, oh, I'm just driving down to the end of the block, and I'll think about not, you know, buckling my seatbelt, or I'm just backing the vehicle out of the driveway, you know, to get it out of the way of something, you know. And sometimes I'll even catch myself thinking, oh, I don't need to buckle my seatbelt, but I do it anyway, because the second I start making exceptions to that, it's no longer a habit for me. You know, make sure you wear that seatbelt. It does various things for you. If you're in an emergency situation, if you are getting bumped or bounced around, you know, because of an accident or something that's going on, having that seatbelt on keeps you in the driver's seat, and it helps you stay in control of the vehicle. If you're not buckled up and you get bumped, it's easy for you to get bounced out of the driver's seat. And I can tell you, I'm alive today because I wore my seatbelt one time and I fell asleep at the wheel and I hit a barrier in the middle of the freeway. And when I hit that barrier, I woke up and I regained control of the vehicle. If I hadn't been buckled up, I know for a fact, and I won't go into the details, but I know for a fact I would have been bounced out of the driver's seat and I wouldn't have been able to regain control of that vehicle. And I believe I'm alive today because a seatbelt kept me in the seat and allowed me to regain control of the vehicle when I did other things not quite right. So it helps you stay in control. It will minimize injury when you're in a collision. It prevents ejections from the vehicle, and it prevents people in the vehicle from becoming human projectiles. And here's some statistics. These come from zerofatalities.com that, you know, kind of spell this out for you a little bit. You know, wearing a seatbelt helps the driver stay in the driver's seat, helps the driver maintain control of the vehicle. I will testify to that one. It does. It saves lives that way. The next one, 3 out of 4 people who are ejected during a fatal crash die from their injuries. So in other words, if you're ejected from a vehicle, you know, as a result of a crash, you have about a 75% chance that you're going to die. from being ejected out of the vehicle. Other statistics I've read say you're 24 times or 25 times more likely to be killed when ejected from the vehicle than if you remain inside the passenger compartment of the vehicle. And so, that's, keeping you safe. It's keeping you alive, keeping you from getting ejected. Over the last 5 years, almost half of all people who died on Utah roadways weren't buckled up. Now, when we get to that number, we're excluding pedestrians, bicycles, bus occupants, motorcycle riders, people for whom seatbelts aren't an option. So if you just look at the fatalities that occurred where someone could have been wearing a seatbelt, but they were killed, almost half of those are people not wearing their seatbelt. How many people don't wear their seatbelts? Well, there's Utah statistics as well as nationwide statistics that pretty much say about 10 to 15% of people is all that don't wear their seatbelts. About 85%, worst case scenario, 80% of people are wearing their seatbelts. And so if we've got half of traffic fatalities coming from the 15% that don't wear their seatbelts, that tells you right there, you're putting yourself at a much greater risk just by choosing not to wear that seatbelt. When a driver is unbuckled, 76% of children riding in that vehicle with them will also be unbuckled. When a driver is buckled, 87% of children riding in that vehicle with that driver will be buckled. So also if you're concerned about, yourself and your family, your little ones, set the example and require it of your passengers. Don't move that vehicle until everybody's buckled up. And finally, in a crash, unbuckled passengers can become a projectile. I call this the human projectile, and it increases the risk of hurting them or others. Often a human projectile flopping around the inside of a car that's rolling over in an accident, will result in the fatal injuries of other occupants of the vehicle who may even be buckled up, but because there's this human body bouncing around in there, landing on top of people's heads and necks, that often will create a risk to others in the vehicle. So 40%, when you have that human projectile, you've got a 40% greater risk of others being hurt or killed because one person wasn't buckled up. So to wrap up, I just would like you to remember that defensive driving, in my mind, when I boil it down to what are the most basic things I need to think about when I'm being a defensive driver, managing your space around your vehicle, your visibility, how well you can see everything around you, and managing your time. Those are probably the most important things that you can do. Keep your eyes moving is another one. Don't allow yourself to just stare down the road or just stare down the lane. Every few seconds, you should be moving your eyes to check a mirror, to check your blind spot, to, be aware of what's going on sidewalks, crosswalks, intersections. One thing I failed to touch on in the right of way is pedestrians. Often we collide with things that we're not looking for, and things that are smaller than trucks and cars, we tend to not look for while we're driving. If you're not actively looking for pedestrians, bicyclists, or motorcycle riders, the tendency is not to see them, even if you're looking right at them. So, make sure that you increase your awareness for pedestrians and cyclists and motorcycles, because it's really easy to think that object is far away because it's small, and you're looking for other cars. You're not looking for small objects. You need to be aware of everything. Adjust for all conditions. Adjust for conditions outside of the vehicle, weather, road, traffic. Adjust for conditions in the vehicle itself. Make sure it's in safe operating condition. Make sure that you are operating the vehicle within its limitations, and be aware of your condition, your physical and mental condition while you're operating the vehicle, and make sure you make the appropriate adjustments for all of those different types of conditions. My challenge to you is no backing accidents. There's two kinds of accidents that we see a ton of, and I mentioned backing accidents already, but rear end collisions is another one, where it's almost guaranteed we're at fault. If we back into somebody or if we drive into the back of somebody else's vehicle. And those are both major causes of our liability claims that we see. And they're both absolutely 100% preventable if you're being a defensive driver, if you're giving yourself extra space, whether that's space while you're driving or space while you're stopped. One of the really common ones we've seen on rear end collisions is where people stop at an intersection or at the top of an off ramp and they get really close to the car in front of them, and that car in front of them starts to move. And so you start to move and then they stop short because they decide they can't go, and then you drive into the back of them. If you give yourself an extra space, you know, leave 20 feet between you and the vehicle in front of you. That way you can avoid that fake out collision where you think they're going and then they stop. You know, just don't be so close. Manage that space. But I challenge you to increase your defensive driving skills to the level where backing accidents and rear end collisions just won't happen anymore. And ultimately, the most important thing, and if you don't take anything else away from this training today, make sure you take this one away. Buckle up. Buckle up every time. Buckle up no matter how short the trip is, you know, and buckle up no matter, you know, what the emergency is. And make sure that everybody in your vehicle buckles up along with you. It is the difference between life and death, time and time and time again. And when we see reductions in fatalities on the roadways, it's generally associated with an increase in the use of seatbelts. So please, if you are not a 100% committed seatbelt user every single time you drive, please make that a goal. Now, I mentioned earlier setting a couple goals, recognizing where you may have some areas that you can work on and set some goals to work on those. If you're not 100% seatbelt wearer, please make that one of your goals. You can't set a goal to work on every single one of these things because you just can't. You know, you're going to remember one and forget about another, you know. And so I really challenge you, to set a goal in the one or two areas where you think your defensive driving can improve the most, and work on those, you know, over the next 6 months, and try to develop new habits. And I promise you, it will probably, in the long run, at some time in your life, those new habits very well could save your life or the life of someone really close to you. Thank you for your attention and participation today. Appreciate each and every one of you. So go out there, have a safe day, and drive safe too. Thanks. Paula, is there any questions that you have or that anybody else has that we should maybe address?
If anyone has questions, would you raise your hand or just unmute and ask your question, please? I don't see anything on the group chat, so.
Okay, thank you all, appreciate you.
Thank you, Doug. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today and give us this wonderful defensive driving training. I am a seatbelt user. It has saved my life. I'm a passionate driver, so that will be my goal. It's a little bit less passion in my driving, since my finance director and public works director have noted that I'm a little bit of an Andretti behind the wheel. So that will be my goal. Thank you, Doug. Have a good day.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.